The officers didn't break into apartment 2B because they wanted to. They broke in because the silence inside felt wrong. Not the kind of quiet that comes from someone sleeping, but the kind that hits you in the gut, cold and heavy, like something precious had just been ripped out of the world. The moment the door finally gave way, the building seemed to hold its breath. No yelling, no crashing, no struggle. Just a stillness so out of place it felt violent. They stepped inside expecting chaos, shards of glass, overturned furniture, some sign that a fight had taken place. But what greeted them was worse. A calm room. A calm table. A calm cup of tea, cooling untouched on the desk. The kind of everyday moment that should have meant someone had just stepped away for a minute, except the air carried a heaviness that said they weren't coming back. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, horribly wrong, but nothing in the room explained it. Nothing except the cold slap of reality waiting by the window. The latch hung open, not wide, just enough to show that someone had pulled it from the outside. A strip of torn curtain fluttered in the chill, caught and twisted in a way no breeze could naturally create. It looked like the last thing Tessa Denton had touched before she was taken out of her own life. The officers exchanged a look, the kind that doesn't need words. They knew. Right there, in that moment, they knew this wasn't someone stepping out to clear their head, or a breakup gone bad. This was a disappearance with intent. A life removed so quietly it felt like the world hadn't noticed yet. But it would, because the silence in that room wasn't peaceful. It was screaming. It was angry. It was the kind of silence that only exists when something terrible has already happened, and the person who caused it is still out there, moving, breathing, living like nothing happened. And the worst part? This was only the first clue. But before we move deeper into this story, before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The deeper the officers stepped into apartment 2B, the more everything felt out of place. Not chaotic, no overturned chairs, no shattered plates, just a room trying too hard to look normal. Too still, too clean, the kind of clean that feels like it's hiding something. The tea on the desk hadn't been touched in hours. The steam was long gone, replaced by a thin skin across the surface, the kind that forms when a drink sits, forgotten, as life gets interrupted. Her textbook lay open, its spine stretched like she'd been planning to return in seconds. But no one had touched it since the moment everything stopped. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. Yet the air carried a heaviness that didn't make sense, like a warning left behind. The window pulled the officer's attention without anyone saying a word. A narrow opening, just enough for a hand to unlatch it. Just enough for someone to slip inside without being seen. The torn nylon curtain fragment twisted against the latch, a tiny detail with a loud message. Someone reached in. Someone grabbed her. Someone stole time she never got back. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was all wrong, and everyone in that room felt it. What hit the officers hardest wasn't what they found in that apartment. It was what they didn't find. No footsteps leading out. No sounds of a struggle. No sign of a last-second fight for survival. Just a life cut out of its own space, leaving behind a hollow that felt almost violent in its stillness. Tessa Denton didn't walk away. She didn't run. She didn't choose to disappear. Her absence felt deliberate, forced, like someone reached in and pulled her out of her own world, leaving everything she cared about frozen in place. Her shoes sat by the door where she always left them. Her coat hung neatly on the rack. Her sketchbook lay open on her bed, half-finished lines waiting for a hand that would never return to complete them. Every object in that room felt like it had been abandoned mid-heartbeat. People talk about missing persons like they're just gone. But standing in that room, it didn't feel like someone went missing. It felt like someone was taken, ripped out of their own story while everything around them stayed painfully untouched. A life was removed. A future was interrupted. And the silence left behind felt like an accusation. While the officers searched for any sign of where Tessa had gone, something small near the window caught their attention, something so tiny it could have been mistaken for lint. A thin strand of electric blue fiber clung to the torn curtain, almost hidden, almost nothing. But it didn't belong to Tessa. It didn't match anything in the apartment. It didn't match her clothes, her blankets, her rug, her life. It felt like the only thing the intruder hadn't managed to take with them. One of the officers leaned closer, lifting it with careful fingers, and for a moment, the room's silence seemed to tighten, as if the entire apartment knew that this scrap held something, a direction, an answer, a truth, but refused to give it up. No one in that room realized it yet, but that tiny fiber would outlast every tip, every false lead, every suspect. It would survive years of dead ends and heartbreak. It would sit in evidence storage like a locked box, waiting for the world to advance enough to finally understand it. It was the only witness that didn't forget, the only clue that refused to fade, and it wouldn't reveal its message for 33 long years. You know what makes this case so disturbing? It wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. It wasn't the kind of chaos you expect when someone is taken against their will. Tessa disappeared in complete silence. The kind that crawls under your skin because it reminds you how quickly life can be interrupted without warning. She vanished without a sound, no crash, no scream, no chance to fight. Ask yourself something honestly. What would you do if someone you love vanished from a locked home? No broken door, no trail. Nothing to explain how they were there one moment and stolen the next. That's the kind of fear that lingers long after the story ends. The fear of a danger you never saw coming. A danger that waits for the perfect moment, quiet, patient, unnoticed. And if this can happen to someone sitting in their own apartment, what else is possible in the shadows of a regular day? This isn't just a mystery. It's a warning about how fast a life can disappear, even in a place that should feel safe. Standing in that apartment, surrounded by the quiet that shouldn't exist, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Monsters don't always break down doors. Sometimes they slip through a window, take everything that matters in seconds, and vanish without leaving a sound. Cases like this don't just shake a community. They remind us how fast danger can strike without warning, how easy it is to overlook the signs until it's too late, and how many people never get the chance for justice because no one was paying attention when it mattered. That's why stories like Tessa's need to be heard from start to finish, not out of curiosity but out of awareness. Subscribe so you never miss cases that hide monsters in plain sight. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If you ignore stories like this, you help killers stay hidden. Subscribe now. And if someone still refuses to subscribe? If you won't subscribe, comment why you're okay letting cases like this slip past you. Your voice, your attention could be the difference between a forgotten case and one that finally gets answers. Chicago on March 17th, 1985, carried the kind of energy that makes a city feel alive. St. Patrick's Day had packed the streets with people laughing, drinking, and trying to forget their troubles for a night. The river glowed green, the crowds spilled out of bars, and the sound of footsteps and cheers bounced between buildings like the whole city was celebrating at once. But as the night stretched on, a different feeling began to settle over Lincoln Park. Not fear, not yet, but a shift, a quiet uneasiness slipping through the cold wind, the kind of unease that arrives without warning, wrapped inside the distant howl of a siren that wasn't supposed to be there, a sound that cut through the noise of celebration like a reminder that joy never protects anyone for long. The tavern doors swung open and shut with warmth pouring out, but the sidewalks felt colder than usual. People pulled their jackets tighter, not because of the temperature, but because something in the air felt off. A tension no one could name, but everyone brushed aside. A couple walking home from a bar paused when they heard another siren wail far too close. Windows trembled. Dogs barked. The wind pushed through the alleyways with an urgency that didn't match the holiday mood. Chicago has always been a city that straddles two worlds, the bright, loud one people show, and the darker one they pray never touches their lives. But on this night, those two worlds moved closer together. No one understood why the streets suddenly felt less friendly. No one knew a young woman's life had just collided with something she never saw coming, and Chicago, a city that thought it had seen everything, was about to lose its breath. Before her name became attached to fear and heartbreak, Tessa Denton was simply living. A two-year-old Loyola art student with a laugh her friends swore could brighten a room, and a habit of leaving paint smudges on everything she owned. She loved quiet mornings, sketching near the window of her Lincoln Park apartment, and she kept a small stack of postcards from museums she hoped to visit someday. Her life wasn't dramatic, it was hopeful. She wasn't the type to disappear. She didn't skip classes. She didn't avoid calls. She didn't cancel plans without telling anyone. People like her don't suddenly walk away from everything they're building. Her parents knew it the moment they heard she was missing. Her friends knew it. Her professors knew it. Even the officers who stepped into her apartment felt it. The signs weren't subtle: her shoes by the door, her coat neatly hanging, her assignments laid out for the week ahead. Nothing about her surroundings hinted at someone preparing to leave. Everything pointed to someone expecting to return. And that's what cuts the deepest. Tessa's life was interrupted, not abandoned. Someone took her dreams, her plans, her future right out of the world she was shaping day by day. She wasn't running away, she was taken. Those words echoed through every person who knew her. They carried pain, anger, disbelief, and the sickening realization that someone had been watching her long before anyone realized the danger. Because you don't steal someone this quietly unless you've studied them first. What Chicago didn't realize that night was that its sense of safety had already been broken long before the officers reached apartment 2B. While crowds celebrated, while music spilled out of every bar, while people laughed their way down crowded sidewalks, someone had already set their eyes on Tessa. Someone had studied her routines. Someone had learned when she came home, when she turned off the lights, when she sat by her window to read or sketch. Someone waited for the moment when her guard was down, not because she was careless, but because no one expects danger to walk straight toward them in a familiar neighborhood. When investigators later pieced together her final hours, one detail stood out more than anything else. Someone selected her. Someone watched her. That single truth changed the entire tone of the case. This wasn't random. This wasn't a desperate act. This was deliberate, the act of someone who planned, waited, and struck at the exact moment when the city was distracted. And the part that should make every viewer stop and think? This wasn't decades ago in some forgotten place. This happens in real cities, to real people, in real neighborhoods. Danger doesn't announce itself, it waits. This happens in real cities. Don't stay unaware, subscribe now. And if someone refuses? If you're not subscribing, explain in the comments why staying uninformed feels safe. Because the truth is simple. You can't protect yourself from dangers you pretend don't exist. And the real horror that night wasn't inside Tessa's apartment. It was what no one could find: the person who took her. Deirdre Callahan had walked that hallway 1,000 times, carrying grocery bags, textbooks, or late-night takeout for herself and Tessa. But on this night, the hallway felt different. Too still, too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your chest and refuses to explain itself. She fumbled for her keys, half distracted, expecting to hear Tessa's music drifting through the door like it usually did. But there was nothing. Not even the soft hum of her friend reading late into the night. The moment she turned the key, her stomach tightened. The door wasn't locked. Tessa never left it unlocked. Deirdre pushed it open slowly, calling her name in a voice already shaking before she understood why. The apartment didn't greet her, it stared back. The lights were off except for the desk lamp glowing faintly across the room. A half-finished cup of tea sat untouched. Tessa's bag rested on the couch exactly where she always dropped it after class. Everything looked normal, painfully normal, but something in the air felt wrong. A pressure she couldn't name, creeping up her spine as she stepped farther inside. Tessa? Her voice echoed in the stillness, but the apartment swallowed the sound whole. She walked toward the desk, confusion tightening into fear. Tessa's coat still hung neatly by the door. Her shoes were lined up exactly the way she always left them. Nothing was disturbed, but nothing felt right. Then she noticed the window. The latch wasn't closed. A strip of curtain hung twisted in the breeze. Her heart dropped. Something had happened here. Something she wasn't ready to see. Deirdre took one shaky step toward the window, her eyes fixed on that twisted piece of curtain. It fluttered as the night air pushed in, as if mocking her with the smallest movement in a room that felt painfully still. Her breath quickened, and she whispered Tessa's name again, not out of habit this time, but out of fear. Her shoes tapped softly on the hardwood, each step carrying a weight she couldn't explain yet. Something in her body already knew the truth her mind refused to accept. She reached the window frame, touched the latch, and felt the cold metal beneath her fingers. Tessa never left the window open. A chill ran through her, sharp enough to make her pull her hand back. She turned slowly, scanning the room again, the cup of tea untouched, the book waiting to be read, the lamp still glowing like someone had just stepped away seconds before. But there was no sign of Tessa, no sound, no movement, no explanation. Her pulse hammered in her ears, the air grew tighter, heavier, almost suffocating. She felt trapped inside a moment she couldn't escape, a moment that shouldn't exist. Then she noticed something on the floor near the desk. A small ceramic pot, shattered, soil scattered across the wood. Tessa cared about her plants. She never knocked them over. This wasn't an accident. The truth slammed into Deirdre all at once, ripping through her like a blade. Something happened here. Something violent. Something she could feel but couldn't see. Her knees weakened, her breath broke, and before she could stop herself, the scream tore out of her, raw, shaking, desperate. A scream that would echo through the hallway and mark the beginning of a nightmare that wouldn't end for decades. The officers reached the apartment within minutes of Deirdre's frantic call, but the moment they stepped through the doorway, the energy in the room shifted. One of them froze just inside, hand resting on his holster, eyes scanning the quiet space as if it might suddenly come alive. Another whispered for Deirdre to wait in the hallway, but she couldn't move. She stood trembling near the doorframe, watching the scene she wished she had never walked into. The lead officer stepped farther inside, his boots brushing against the scattered soil from the broken pot. He crouched briefly, studying the debris before sweeping his flashlight across the floor. No trail. No signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture. The apartment looked like someone had paused it, not invaded it. "What was touched last?" he asked gently, though his voice carried the tension of someone bracing for the worst. "Tessa's tea," Deirdre whispered. "She was drinking it before I left this afternoon." The officer examined the cup, still warm enough that it hadn't been sitting out all night. That detail alone tightened the room like a vice. Another officer checked the window, pushing lightly on the frame. "Latch isn't broken," he muttered. "Was it normally locked?" "Yes," Deirdre said without hesitation. Her answer dropped into the silence like a stone. One of the officers opened the bedroom door, expecting chaos, signs of a fight, anything that would explain why Deirdre was shaking so violently. But the room was exactly how Tessa left it that morning, books stacked neatly, sketches clipped to her board, blanket pulled halfway down the bed as if she had planned to return soon. Nothing made sense. No theft. No forced entry. No struggle. Just an apartment that looked like its owner had stepped out for a moment and never returned. The officers spread out through the apartment, each one moving with the kind of caution usually reserved for active crime scenes, yet nothing around them behaved like one. Every detail they examined only deepened the unease pressing against the walls. The living room looked untouched, as if time had stalled right after Tessa's last breath of normal life. A pencil lay beside an open notebook on the desk, stopped mid-line as though she had been interrupted. A few sketching tools rested neatly in their tray. A sweater draped over the back of a chair, still holding the faint shape of her shoulders. Every detail insisted she would return any moment, but she didn't. One officer checked the kitchen drawers and cabinets, all closed. No sign of someone searching for valuables. The fridge door had a smudge near the handle, the kind that comes from routine use, not force. Another officer stood in front of the bookshelf, eyes narrowing at the dust patterns. Nothing had been brushed aside. No items knocked over. No marks on the floor that suggested an intruder moving quickly or aggressively. "How does someone disappear from a locked home?" one officer whispered, not really expecting an answer. Deirdre heard him, and her breath caught in her throat. The officers checked closets, looked under the bed, and examined the bathroom. Every space repeated the same message. Tessa should have been there. Every room insisted she hadn't left willingly. The silence felt loud, almost hostile, as if the apartment itself resisted revealing what had happened. It held its secrets tightly, too tightly, offering no hint of struggle, fear, or escape. It was a room that looked complete, while holding the space where a life should have been. One of the officers walked toward the center of the room and stopped abruptly, eyes fixed on a barely visible smear near the floorboard, not enough to confirm anything, but enough to shift the entire mood in the apartment. He knelt slowly, scanning the area with a flashlight, his breathing growing tighter as he realized what it could mean. Deirdre watched from the doorway, hands covering her mouth, her body trembling as the officer stood again. His expression told her everything she needed to know. Whatever happened to Tessa wasn't a misunderstanding, wasn't a simple disappearance. Something violent had happened here, even if the room refused to admit it. The officer turned to his partner. "We're treating this as an abduction." Those words hit the air like a hammer. The silence wasn't confusion anymore, it was confirmation. Someone had taken Tessa. Someone had removed her from her own home without leaving a trace. Someone capable, deliberate, and confident enough to slip away without a sound. And right here, at this moment, when every comfortable assumption collapses, is where viewers need to confront the reality of cases like this. If you'd want justice in a case like this, hit subscribe now. Because stories like Tessa's aren't just headlines, they're warnings. And if someone refuses, not subscribing, then tell us in the comments what detail in this room wouldn't let you sleep tonight. Because everyone who steps into a scene like this walks away with a detail that haunts them, a detail they can't unsee, a detail their mind keeps circling back to. So tell me, what would disturb you the most walking into this room? When news spread that Tessa was missing, the community didn't hesitate to point fingers. And the first name whispered in corners, muttered in classrooms, and traded across coffee counters was Owen Healy, Tessa's boyfriend. Owen wasn't a calm man. Anyone who knew him could tell you that much. He lived at the edges of his emotions, quick to defend, quick to argue, quick to let frustration take over a conversation that should have stayed gentle. There were nights neighbors heard them arguing, voices rising, doors slamming, not violence but tension. Enough tension to plant doubts the moment Tessa disappeared. So when police knocked on his door, Owen didn't act like a man ready for a polite conversation. He stumbled through answers, pacing, running his hands through his hair, eyes wild with fear and confusion. He kept saying her name like he was afraid speaking it too loudly might break him. "What do you mean she's gone? When did this happen? Why would she leave without calling me?" Every question collided with emotion, not clarity. The officers watched his reactions closely. Those first minutes mattered more than he realized. His agitation, his inability to stay still, the sharpness in his voice, all of it fed suspicion. And in the chaos of a missing person case, emotional volatility looks a lot like guilt. Friends turned cold. Students at Loyola whispered that Owen had finally snapped. Even some of Tessa's family wondered if his temper had crossed a line. He became the center of pressure before evidence even entered the conversation. A young man drowning in grief and confusion, while the city quietly decided he must have been the one who took her. The truth? He wasn't the threat. But no one knew that yet. The interrogation room felt like a box closing in on Owen Healy. A table, 2 chairs, harsh lighting, no comfort, no reassurance, just suspicion staring back at him from across the metal surface. Detectives didn't ease into their questions. They pushed hard from the moment he sat down. "When did you last see Tessa? Why were neighbors hearing arguments? Did you two fight yesterday? Where were you last night?" Owen's hands shook as he answered. Not just from fear, from the crushing pressure of being treated like the only possible suspect. His voice cracked every time he mentioned her name. He kept wiping tears with the back of his sleeve, desperate to make them believe him. "I loved her. I wouldn't hurt her," he repeated, almost begging. But emotion wasn't evidence. Detectives dissected every pause, every stumble, every shift of his eyes. They dug into the past moments he wished he could take back, things he said when he was angry, nights when he slammed a door too hard. They brought them all to the table like they were proof of guilt. Hours bled together. Owen's breathing turned shallow. His voice grew hoarse. He answered the same questions again and again, as if somehow saying it one more time would suddenly sound convincing. Then his alibi surfaced, not from him, but from records that detectives pulled mid-interrogation. Owen had been in Joliet, on stage, performing at a local bar. Dozens of people saw him. The time-stamped photographs, the receipts, the sound engineer's notes, all of it confirmed he was miles away when Tessa disappeared. He wasn't their suspect, but the damage was done. Precious hours had already slipped through their fingers. Hours the real predator used well. When Owen's alibi finally checked out, the interrogation room fell silent. Detectives exchanged looks that carried more regret than relief. Hours had been drained, hours they would never get back, and the man sitting in that chair wasn't the threat they needed to fear. They released Owen into a night colder than the one he walked in from. He staggered out of the station, eyes swollen, face pale, looking like someone who'd aged years in a single afternoon. The community had already shaped a narrative around him, one that would cling to his name long after he was cleared. But the most frightening part wasn't the damage done to Owen. It was the realization that, during all those hours, the real predator moved without interruption. While detectives cornered the wrong man, while the city whispered and speculated, while suspicion swallowed time, the actual threat stayed invisible, confident, and entirely unbothered. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He knew they were looking in the wrong direction. And that's the kind of person who becomes dangerous, not the one panicking in a chair, but the one who knows how to wait. This is where viewers need to understand the stakes. Predators thrive when attention slips. Don't be that person. Subscribe. And if someone refuses, still not subscribing, comment why missing red flags doesn't bother you. Because the truth is harsh. While everyone obsessed over the wrong suspect, the real danger continued walking through the world unnoticed, and cases like this don't slow down for misplaced suspicion. A cold fact remained. The person who took Tessa was still out there, and no one was closer to finding him. Before Tessa's disappearance gained citywide attention, Lincoln Park residents had already been talking quietly, cautiously, never loud enough to sound paranoid. It started with small remarks in laundry rooms, comments exchanged while waiting for buses, conversations murmured at the corner store. Someone tall, someone always wearing a long coat, someone who didn't walk with purpose, just stood and watched. He was first mentioned by an older woman who lived across from the Denton's building. She claimed she saw him late one night, standing near the alley, hands buried in his pockets, staring up at the windows as if counting them. She said she locked her door twice that night and kept the chain on until morning. A few days later, a jogger mentioned seeing a man matching the same outline near the playground just before dawn, unmoving, positioned behind a row of trees. When she looked back a second time, he was gone. Not walked away, gone. Another neighbor told police he spotted the man near the laundromat, leaning against a lamppost, face angled downward. He couldn't describe the man's features, only the height, the coat, and the way he stayed silent even when someone passed close enough to brush shoulders. What frightened people wasn't his presence. It was the way he blended into the background until someone truly looked. He wasn't doing anything illegal. He wasn't trespassing. He wasn't even interacting with anyone. He was simply there, watching buildings, watching windows, watching people who didn't yet know they should be afraid. These whispers grew into a pattern, and that pattern grew into concern, the kind that makes an entire neighborhood start to pay attention without ever admitting they're scared. Because no one could say who he was, only that he returned, and that he never came close enough to see clearly. When detectives began gathering statements from Lincoln Park residents, they expected inconsistencies but not chaos. Every witness had seen a man, yet no two accounts aligned enough to build anything useful. One resident swore the man had dark hair. Another insisted he was bald. A third claimed his hair was hidden under a cap. Some said he walked with a slight limp. Others said he stood completely still, like he barely breathed. One college student even suggested the man looked younger than everyone else assumed, though she admitted she never saw him up close. What puzzled detectives most wasn't the differences. Those were normal. It was how each witness remembered only pieces. No one could describe his face. Not the eyes, not the jawline, not even a general age range. Just a height, a coat, and the feeling that he was studying the world around him without needing to move. A man who appeared fully present, yet left no detailed imprint on the memory. Did he glare at you? Did he seem angry? No, he just watched. Did he move when you noticed him? No, maybe. I don't know. Did you see his face? Not really. It became clear that he wasn't approaching people, he was observing them. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to unsettle anyone who caught him in their peripheral vision. Some residents began second-guessing themselves. Maybe they imagined him. Maybe he wasn't the same person each time. Maybe it was just coincidence. But the pattern refused to fade. People saw fragments of him, height, coat, stillness, yet no one could say who he was. It was as if the neighborhood shared a collective shadow, shifting shape depending on who happened to glance up at the right or wrong moment. a presence that felt real, without ever becoming clear. As more residents came forward, the neighborhood's confidence began to crumble. People who once walked their dogs after dark now hurried home before the sun dipped behind the buildings. Curtains that usually stayed open were suddenly pulled shut. Locks were checked twice, then a third time, because the whispers kept circling back to the same unsettling idea. Someone was out there studying them, not interacting, not speaking, not threatening, just watching. Parents waited outside schools earlier than usual, scanning the sidewalk for anyone who didn't seem to belong. Joggers began avoiding certain blocks entirely, claiming the air felt heavier near the alleyways where sightings were reported. Even the local bar saw fewer late-night regulars. The walk home felt too exposed. Detectives tried to reassure the community, but reassurance means nothing when people are already imagining footsteps behind them. Residents described the man again and again, hoping one version might finally make sense. Tall, long coat, stillness, nothing else. That was the pattern no one could break. No one could describe his voice. No one remembered his walk. No one could explain how he disappeared so quickly after being noticed. One neighbor summed it up best during her interview. Witnesses saw fragments, never the face. And that single line lingered over Lincoln Park like a warning. It suggested that whoever he was, he knew exactly how much of himself to reveal and how much to hide. The sense of being watched settled over the community like a weight. Not enough to cause open panic, but enough to make everyone glance behind them before unlocking their doors. Lincoln Park didn't have proof of danger, but it had fear. And fear, once planted, doesn't fade on its own. Detective Anton Kincaid arrived at the scene long after the first wave of officers had combed through the apartment. He stepped inside with the steady posture of a man who'd seen too many families broken by unanswered questions, yet still carried the weight of each one. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply observed the type of observation that made younger officers straighten up without being told. He scanned the living room, noticing what most wouldn't. A cup of tea cooling on the table, a notebook waiting for its owner, a sweater draped over a chair, as if expecting warmth to return. These were the details that spoke louder than scattered objects or broken glass. They told him Tessa Denton hadn't walked out freely. Kincaid paused near the window, fingertips grazing the loose curtain edge. The open window bothered him, not because it suggested entry but because it suggested confidence. Whoever took Tessa didn't panic. They took their time. They left without leaving chaos behind. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence settle. He could always tell when a room held fear, and this one did. Not loud fear, silent fear. The kind that lingers long after the danger has left. He questioned Deirdre gently, listening as she tried to recount her discovery without breaking down, and with each answer she struggled to give, his concern deepened. The absence of a body meant hope was still possible, but he also knew it often meant the worst kind of ending. A missing woman. No forced entry. No struggle. No explanation. Kincaid had walked into many grim situations, but something about this one tightened his chest in a way he couldn't ignore. This wasn't a disappearance. This was a theft of a life. The breakthrough came not from a dramatic moment, but from a quiet observation made hours after the initial sweep. A crime scene technician crouched near the window, shining a small beam of light across the floorboards. Something caught the reflection, a tiny speck clinging to the wood grain. He picked it up with tweezers, holding it carefully under the beam. A single thread. Electric blue, barely half an inch long. To anyone else, it would have looked like lint from a jacket or carpet fuzz, something to brush away without a second thought. But to Kincaid, who stood behind the technician watching closely, it felt like the only breath of direction they'd been given. "Where was it?" he asked. "Just here," the technician murmured. Close to where the curtain tore. Kincaid studied the fiber, frustration tightening his jaw. A clue that small shouldn't matter, but when everything else screamed, no answers, even a speck of color felt like a lifeline. They sealed it carefully, labeling it with the precision of people who understood how cases can hinge on details most eyes never notice. Kincaid stared at the evidence bag for a long moment, already sensing the struggle ahead. A single thread wasn't going to hand them the truth. It would demand time, and time was the one thing they didn't have. Still, he refused to dismiss it. Someone had been in that room. Someone close enough to brush against a curtain or step near the window. Someone careless enough to leave behind the smallest trace of themselves. It wasn't the answer, but it was the only thing pointing toward one. And Kincaid held onto it the way a drowning man holds onto a rope, knowing it might not save her, but hoping it could. Back at the lab, the electric blue fiber sat under magnification as technicians debated what it might belong to. Carpet, clothing, upholstery, they couldn't even agree on the category. The technology available at the time allowed them to determine the color and the basic texture, but nothing more. No manufacturer, no match in any database. No link to a specific object. Kincaid stood behind the glass, arms crossed, listening as one technician explained why the fiber couldn't give them what they needed. "We can't trace it," she said. "We don't have the equipment." Not yet. Not yet. Two words that felt like a punch to the chest. Kincaid leaned in, trying to see the fiber as more than a thread. Trying to imagine it holding the truth that science simply wasn't ready to reveal. Every time he thought about Tessa, alone and missing, frustration carved deeper into him. "What about comparison to local manufacturers?" he asked. "We don't have the resources to run that." "What about matching it to clothing fibers?" "No luck." "So it tells us nothing?" "Not nothing, just not enough." Not enough was death to an investigation like this. They bagged the fiber again, labeling it with a date that would haunt Kincaid for decades. He stared at it through the plastic, anger settling in his stomach. It was the closest thing to a fingerprint left in the apartment, and it was useless. He imagined the person who left it behind, someone confident enough to carry out an abduction without leaving a scene in chaos, someone careful but not perfect, someone whose one mistake lay in Kincaid's hands, yet out of reach. The truth was sitting right there, and every tool they had was still years away from speaking its language. Weeks turned into months, and the search for Tessa Denton shifted from frantic urgency to something quieter, something that felt like surrender. The early leads dried up, the tip line stopped ringing, and the community's once-burning fear cooled into uncomfortable silence. Without new evidence, detectives could only circle the same points until the same walls pushed back. Kincaid visited the Denton family often, each time carrying the weight of another unanswered day. Vivian Denton always opened the door with hope in her eyes, and every time he had to look at her and tell her there was nothing new. Each visit felt heavier than the last. Alvin Denton stopped asking questions, stopped pacing the living room, stopped talking about possibilities. He just stared at the floor, holding on to the idea of his daughter's return like a thread, slowly thinning between his fingers. The file grew thicker, but the progress didn't. The blue fiber sat sealed in evidence storage, a reminder of how close they were to understanding what happened and how powerless they were to act. Every time Kincaid saw it, it felt like a taunt. A clue frozen in time, surrounded by technology that couldn't unlock its truth. And one morning, after exhausting every lead, Kincaid wrote the words he had fought to avoid. Case suspended pending new evidence. It was the kind of sentence that felt like a betrayal. The kind that leaves a family shattered. The kind that leaves a detective staring at his reflection, wondering if he failed someone he never even knew. This is the moment viewers need to understand the cruelty of time. Cases go cold when people look away. Don't be another blind eye. Subscribe. If someone refuses, won't subscribe, comment why letting cases fade doesn't bother you. Because the truth is simple. A case doesn't die overnight. It dies when the world stops paying attention. And that's exactly what happened to Tessa Denton. For the first week, Tessa's disappearance dominated local broadcasts. News anchors repeated her name every evening, her photo flashed across screens, and journalists crowded the steps of the Denton home looking for any update they could turn into a headline. Strangers shared her story, hoping someone somewhere might know something. By the second week, the coverage slowed. By the third, it stopped. Another crime, another crisis, another tragedy with more immediate drama replaced her story on the nightly news. The Dentons didn't even realize the shift at first. They were too busy making calls, printing flyers, and refusing to let exhaustion win. But one night, when Vivian turned on the television hoping for an update, she didn't hear Tessa's name. Not once. Not even in passing. It was as if the city had decided her life had reached its deadline for public interest. The reporters who once hovered outside quietly drifted away. The phones stopped ringing. Neighbors stopped knocking with casseroles and hopeful expressions. Even the people who promised they would stay invested slowly slipped back into their routines. Meanwhile, the Denton home remained frozen in the moment their daughter vanished. Vivian kept Tessa's room exactly the same, smoothing the blankets each morning, as if preparing for her to return that afternoon. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, marking time the rest of Chicago no longer cared about. Alvin sat at the dining table each night with the same cup of coffee, untouched, cooling just like the one Tessa left behind. The city moved on quietly. The Dentons couldn't. Their world had stopped, and it refused to restart. Days inside the Denton home no longer followed any rhythm. Morning, afternoon, and night blended into one long stretch of waiting for a phone call, a knock on the door, a sign that Tessa was still somewhere in the world. Grief didn't arrive all at once. It seeped into corners, spreading through the house until every room felt different. Vivian kept Tessa's belongings untouched. Her sketchbook stayed open on her desk, pencil placed neatly beside it. Her favorite scarf remained draped over the bedpost. Even the laundry basket in her closet still held the clothes she meant to wash on the day she vanished. For Vivian, moving anything felt like closing a door she refused to shut. Alvin reacted differently. He wandered from room to room like a man searching for instructions that didn't exist. Some nights he sat in the hallway outside Tessa's bedroom, leaning against the wall, listening to the silence as though waiting for footsteps that never came. He checked the mailbox constantly, despite knowing there wouldn't be a letter. One afternoon, when a social worker visited to offer support, Vivian said something the woman never forgot. "We can't say goodbye to air." She wasn't being poetic. She was naming a truth no parent should face. How do you mourn someone when you don't know where they are? How do you move forward when every quiet moment feels like betrayal? Friends stopped visiting as often. Not out of cruelty, but because they didn't know what to say. The Dentons didn't blame them. They understood. Their grief had become too heavy for casual conversation. But they carried it anyway, because they had no choice. Love held them in place long after hope had begun to thin. Detective Anton Kincaid never filed Tessa's case away in his mind, even when the paperwork said it was no longer active. Some cases fade as the years move forward. This one didn't. It settled into him not as a failure, but as something unfinished, something that refused to release its grip. He kept a copy of the case file in his desk drawer long after protocol required it. Every few months, he would open it during late-night shifts, flipping through the same photographs, the same statements, the same evidence log. He would stop on the photograph of the electric blue fiber every time, staring at it as if willing it to speak. He replayed that first walk through Tessa's apartment over and over. What had he missed? What detail should have stood out more sharply? He wasn't the type of man who threw blame around to protect his conscience. He carried it instead, letting it settle on him quietly. Some nights he drove past the Denton home, slowing as he passed the porch light Vivian always left on. He never stopped. He never knocked. He just watched from the street, promising himself he would find a way to bring them answers one day. Time didn't soften the weight, it increased it. Each year without progress felt like another apology he owed, but couldn't deliver. Tessa's absence didn't become easier to accept. It became harder, because the world kept moving while her story remained trapped in the same unanswered moment. This is the point where the viewers, the community, matter most. Join our community so stories like Tessa's are never forgotten. Because cases don't stay alive on their own. People keep them alive. The hardest part for the Denton family wasn't the fear of what might have happened to Tessa. It was the torment of not knowing. Every passing day felt like standing at a crossroads with no signposts, a place where hope and heartbreak ran side by side, never letting them choose one or the other. Vivian woke each morning with the same thought, maybe today. Alvin ended each night with the same question, how much longer can we live like this? Neither answer brought comfort. They tried support groups, counseling, endless conversations with clergy, but nothing filled the emptiness left by the absence of truth. Grief without answers doesn't behave like ordinary grief. It lingers. It sharpens. It drains a person in ways no one sees. Birthdays became the hardest days of all. Vivian would bake a cake every year, even when friends gently suggested she shouldn't. She wasn't celebrating, she was holding on. Lighting a candle felt like choosing her daughter again and again, even when the world expected her to move forward. Alvin spent those days sitting quietly with an old photo album open on the table. He traced the edges of Tessa's childhood pictures with trembling fingers, as if touching them might somehow reach the part of the world where she had vanished. People often ask how families survive tragedies like this. The Dentons would never pretend to know the answer. But there is one question every viewer must confront, a question that carries the weight of this entire story. What would keep you going if this happened to your family? It's not a question meant to frighten. It's meant to open the heart, to make sure Tessa's story sinks deep enough that it can't be ignored. Because for the Dentons, survival wasn't a choice. It was the only thing left. Years slipped by in Chicago, reshaping the city one block at a time. New storefronts replaced old ones, neighborhoods shifted, and the skyline continued its climb toward the clouds. Streets that once echoed with the same familiar sounds grew unrecognizable as generations changed. People arrived, people left, and the city pulsed with constant forward motion. But not every part of Chicago moved with the times. Hidden inside a small corner of the police archives sat a cardboard box labeled Case #height 5-317. It rested behind rows of more recent files, untouched except for the occasional glance from an archivist doing inventory. To the world, it was just another cold case. To the Denton family, it was the wound that never closed. Outside those walls, life continued with the speed of a place that refused to slow down. Festivals came and went, new transit lines were built. Entire communities evolved into versions of themselves that didn't resemble the past. Young people walked streets where Tessa once studied, unaware of the shadow that moment in history left behind. Detective Anton Kincaid watched these changes from a distance. He aged alongside the city, but the case he couldn't solve remained the same. What once consumed every waking hour of his workday was now a memory he carried quietly, tucked into the back of his mind alongside regrets he never voiced. Chicago gained new lights, new hopes, new stories. Yet one story stayed frozen, sealed in an envelope, hidden in a box few people even knew existed. The city may have outgrown its memories, but the truth never moved an inch. Inside the police archives, time left its fingerprints everywhere. Paper faded, ink softened, labels peeled at the corners. Boxes held stories the city no longer remembered, and the older they became, the farther they drifted behind newer tragedies demanding attention. Case #height 5-317 sat on a shelf that grew heavier with each passing year. It wasn't mistreated, just forgotten. The officers who once worked on it transferred, retired, or moved into new roles. Detectives who'd heard the story secondhand eventually stopped asking questions, assuming the silence meant there was nothing left worth revisiting. The case file changed hands so many times that it became little more than a number placed on reports, a number typed into databases, a number representing a young woman who once filled rooms with laughter, who once planned her future with excitement, who once believed she had decades ahead of her. Kincaid visited the archives only a few times after he left active duty. Each visit grew shorter, not because he cared any less, but because his body no longer carried the same strength it once did. He would stand in front of the shelves, eyes scanning familiar case numbers, until he reached the one that felt like a scar. He would rest his hand on the edge of the box, tracing the date on the label. No matter how many years passed, he could still remember the quiet inside Tessa's apartment, the open window, the thread of blue sealed in an evidence bag. New officers passed by him in the archive room, barely noticing the older man lost in thought. They didn't know the story. They didn't recognize the name. And when he stepped away from the shelf, the box remained behind, sinking deeper into the background. The dust grew thicker. The silence grew heavier. The truth waited, untouched, but not forgotten. In a sealed evidence envelope inside that same dusty box lay the one detail no one in 1985 could decode: the electric blue fiber. A strip so small it seemed useless, yet so distinct it refused to blend in with any other trace collected that night. Officers had bagged it with care, logged it, stored it, and then left it to sleep in darkness. The fiber sat beside faded photographs of Tessa's apartment. It rested on top of typed reports filed by men and women who no longer wore badges. It waded through heat waves, blizzards, reorganizations, budget cuts, and the slow churn of 3 decades. Every so often, an archivist's sorting boxes would pause, tilt their head at the color inside the envelope, then set it back down, unaware of what it represented. To them, it was clutter from another time, nothing more. But the fiber didn't change. It didn't decay. It didn't lose its voice. Science advanced. Technology surged forward. Entire fields of forensics evolved beyond anything possible when Tessa vanished. Machines were invented that could read details the human eye would never catch. Microscopes grew sharper. Chemical analysis methods became precise in ways early investigators couldn't have imagined. And all that progress grew around the fiber like a rising tide, inching closer every year, until it reached a point where the clue that once meant nothing was suddenly capable of speaking louder than any witness ever had. For 33 years the city moved on. The people involved in the case aged. But the fiber stayed exactly as it was, waiting for the moment someone would finally notice its true importance. A moment that was coming fast. Closer than anyone realized. And when it arrived, everything would shift. By 2018, the Chicago Police Department had newer faces, newer systems, and a renewed focus on unresolved files gathering dust. Among the detectives pushing for these reviews was Lena Hollis, a woman known for her calm precision and the kind of persistence that made closed doors feel temporary. Unlike the original team, Lena had no memory of the case's media frenzy, no emotional exhaustion tied to it, and no fear of digging up the failures of those who came before her. She approached every file as if it were brand new, every detail as if it deserved a second chance. It was that mindset, a refusal to accept that time automatically erased relevance, that led her to case #height 5 to 317. She pulled the box from the shelf the same way Kincaid once did, but her reaction was different. She didn't sigh. She didn't shake her head. She didn't dwell on how long it had sat untouched. She simply opened it and began reading, page by page, with a fresh curiosity that had no limits. She paused when she reached the evidence list. There it was. Item #7, blue fiber, recovered near window frame. Most detectives would have dismissed it. Too small. Too old. Too vague. But Lena had built her reputation on noticing what others passed over. She lifted the sealed envelope carefully, turning it under the light, watching the sliver of blue shift inside. Previous reports dismissed it as a possible clothing fiber, maybe from Tessa, maybe from the suspect. Nothing conclusive. Nothing useful. But Lena didn't care about old assumptions. She cared about what modern technology could reveal. She placed the envelope on her desk, leaned back, and whispered to herself, this might be the piece no one bothered to listen to. She didn't know it yet, but she had just cracked open the door the case needed. Lena Hollis didn't believe in waiting. Once she identified the blue fiber as the case's most overlooked detail, she filed a formal request to have it re-examined using the newest forensic options available. She prepared the paperwork the same day, ignoring the quiet surprise from colleagues who had never seen anyone chase a single fragment with this level of urgency. She packed the envelope herself, slipping it into a secure container bound for the State Forensic Laboratory in Springfield. The courier service logged the transfer, sealed the shipment, and began the trip south, miles of highway separating the present from the mistakes of the past. As the evidence traveled, Lena kept reading through decades of reports. She traced every interview, every lead, every theory that once seemed promising and later collapsed. She didn't treat the old team as failures. She treated the case as unfinished business. Somewhere in those pages the truth had been hiding in plain reach. But the fiber stayed on her mind, too smooth to be clothing, too consistent in texture, too structured to be random. Something about it felt out of place inside a residential apartment. When the lab confirmation of receipt arrived in her inbox, Lena exhaled slowly. It was the first truly forward step this case had taken in 33 years. The Springfield team began their process: microscopy, density tests, chemical extraction, spectral analysis. Instruments far beyond anything available in 1985 were now breaking down the fiber at a level earlier investigators couldn't have imagined. Hours passed, then days. Finally, an email appeared from the lead analyst. A single sentence that made Lena straighten in her chair. "We've identified the source material, and it changes the entire case." Lena opened the analyst's email expecting a routine update, maybe a confirmation that the fiber was inconclusive, maybe a technical explanation that led nowhere. What she found instead made her grip the edge of her desk. The report didn't just challenge the old assumption, it erased it. The fiber wasn't from clothing. It wasn't from furniture. It wasn't from anything typically found inside a student apartment. The lab's mass spectrometry tests pointed to something entirely different, a synthetic backing used in commercial office carpeting during the early 1980 seconds. A detail so specific, so rare, so telling, that it narrowed the possible locations dramatically. Lena read the line 3 times, letting the implications hit her one by one. This meant the suspect had been somewhere with access to a workplace that used this material. It meant the fiber wasn't left accidentally, it transferred from a setting Tessa never entered. It meant the person who took her had come from a location outside her home life and social circle. It wasn't clothing. It came from a workplace. The sentence echoed in the room, changing everything. She pressed her hands against the case file, feeling the weight of the revelation. For decades, the investigation chased the wrong environments, apartments, alleys, personal belongings. But this single clue pointed the case toward somewhere far more controlled, far more structured, a place Tessa would never have willingly gone. And whoever brought that fiber into her apartment didn't stumble into her life. He carried part of his world with him. A trace that never should have survived this long. A trace that was now ready to expose him. Lena pushed her chair back, reached for the roster lists and whispered, "All right, let's find the building and the man this came from." Lena Hollis stared at the lab report again, letting the confirmation sink in. The blue fragment came from commercial office carpeting used during the early 1980 seconds. Not residential, not retail. A specific industrial-grade product installed in workplaces across Chicago during that era. This changed the entire direction of the investigation. She pulled out an old city procurement directory from the archives, a thick, aging volume filled with company names, building material suppliers, and large-scale renovation projects from decades earlier. The pages crackled as she turned them, flipping through lists of contractors who once operated across the city. There were dozens of buildings, government offices, private corporations, university departments, hospitals, banks, locations that saw heavy foot traffic from workers, janitorial staff, and maintenance crews. Any one of them could have been the source of the fiber. It was overwhelming, but Lena wasn't looking for every building, she was looking for one. She created a digital chart, logging every business or institution that purchased the type of flooring the lab identified. Records from that era weren't perfect, but enough survived to build a workable map. Bit by bit, she marked each location on a city grid, watching Chicago's layout fill with colored dots representing potential sources. But the problem grew. Many of the buildings had been renovated multiple times since 1985. Some no longer existed. Others changed owners repeatedly. Tracking down original installation records felt like chasing ghosts. Still, Lena kept going. When she combined these flooring purchase records with employee and contractor logs from that period, a pattern finally began to form. Several names repeated across different buildings: janitors, repairmen, night shift cleaners, people who moved between workplaces unnoticed, entering offices when they were empty and silent. One of those names would change everything. But the pattern wasn't complete yet. There was still another step before she found him. Lena enlarged her city map, zooming in on clusters of buildings that used the same type of commercial carpet. When she cross-checked those locations with staff lists, the clutter of names gradually thinned. Office employees worked one building each. Administrators rarely crossed locations. Security guards stayed within the same block. But the night cleaning crews? They moved everywhere. They worked unseen, often hired through third-party agencies, covering multiple sites scattered across the city. Their schedules overlapped across office towers, administrative buildings, and university facilities. And according to payroll records from the 1980 seconds, the same handful of workers appeared in multiple places where the flooring had been installed. This was the first solid lead the case had produced in decades. Lena created a new list names of every janitor, maintenance worker, or overnight cleaner with access to more than one of the mapped buildings. The list was short. Surprisingly short considering how many locations existed back then. Many workers had moved away, retired, or passed on. A few left Chicago entirely, but 5 names remained active in the region during the year Tessa disappeared. Lena checked their employment histories. 1 worked only downtown. 1 left Illinois in 1984. 2 had no record of being anywhere near Tessa's neighborhood. Only 1 name appeared near the Loyola campus during the exact time period the flooring was installed in university offices. Her pulse sharpened as she ran background searches. This was the first moment the case felt like it was shifting, the first moment the list of possibilities didn't stretch endlessly. Every time she narrowed the data, 1 name kept drifting closer to the center. But she wasn't ready to jump. Not yet. She needed 1 more piece of proof before she confronted what the records were pushing her toward. And that piece was waiting in a place no one had checked in over 30 years. Lena turned her attention to Loyola University's archived facility records. The type of flooring identified by the Springfield lab had been installed in several offices on the northern side of campus during the early 1982. Budget notes confirmed the project was completed by a contracted maintenance team hired through a regional clearing agency. She dug into the roster. Most of the names meant nothing, workers who came and went within months. But then she saw it. Arthur Vesper. He wasn't listed as a full-time employee. He wasn't faculty. He wasn't even part of the campus-operated maintenance department. He belonged to the outsourced night crew, responsible for cleaning empty offices after staff went home. His file was thin. Just a badge number, scattered timesheets, and a short employment window. But it placed him on campus during the exact period the commercial flooring was installed. Lena checked his address history. Vesper lived only a short train ride from Tessa's neighborhood in 1985, close enough to pass unnoticed, far enough to avoid being considered a local suspect during the initial investigation. The more she compared timelines, the tighter the overlap grew. Vesper's shifts aligned with late-night cleaning schedules. Those schedules corresponded with the installation period. And the installation period matched the origin of the fiber. Still, she needed more. She looked for any indication Vesper had reason to be near Tessa's apartment. At first, nothing stood out. No connection through work, no shared acquaintances, no obvious overlap. But then Lena found a curious detail buried inside a transportation log. Vesper once requested temporary reassignment to a north side route running dangerously close to where Tessa lived. It wasn't enough to name him outright. Not yet. But it was the first moment the shadows started forming a shape. And Lena was ready to push further. Once Arthur Vesper's name appeared twice in unrelated logs, Lena revisited every data set she'd compiled: flooring deliveries, contractor rosters, transportation records, payroll files. She looked for anything that placed him in the wrong place at the right time. The pattern formed fast. Vesper wasn't just present during the carpet installation at Loyola. He also worked late-night shifts at 2 other buildings that used the same material. His schedule moved across the city in a loop that matched the distribution of the flooring almost perfectly. It wasn't random. It wasn't luck. It was opportunity, the kind no one questioned in 1985. Lena highlighted his routes, mapping them over Tessa's neighborhood. He passed through the same transit stops she used. He worked night shifts during the exact months she walked home from evening classes. Their paths crossed just enough to suggest something far more deliberate than chance. Then she opened the personnel notes from the contracting agency. Vesper had been described as quiet, reliable, always willing to take extra routes. He signed up for late-night shifts no one else wanted. He changed locations frequently. And he left the job abruptly in mid-1985, weeks after Tessa disappeared. That abrupt exit froze Lena in her seat. People don't quit without notice after major city projects, unless they're running from something. And the timing was too close, uncomfortably close, to be dismissed. Lena leaned back, eyes locked on his name. Everything pointed toward him. Every line converged on his movements. Every unanswered question circled the same man who slipped through the cracks 3 decades earlier. The fiber hadn't just given them a clue. It had given them a direction. And Lena Hollis was ready to follow it to the end. Section 11 would finish what Section 10 started. Arthur Vesper's house sat on a calm street in Naperville, trimmed hedges, a neat driveway, a yard lined with flowers he tended himself. Nothing about the property hinted at chaos, and nothing about the man who lived there raised alarms. Neighbors waved when he passed. Kids on bikes greeted him by name. Parents thanked him for volunteering during Little League season. To anyone watching from the outside, Arthur was the kind of man people trusted immediately, soft-spoken, dependable, the type who fixed a fence without being asked, the kind who remembered birthdays, the kind who never made noise, never caused problems, never flashed a sign of who he truly was. The mask had been in place for decades. Lena Hollis studied his background file with growing unease. His work history showed stability. His personal life showed nothing unusual, no criminal record, no violent past. No patterns investigators typically look for. It was a life built to fit in, and he fit in so well that even the police never noticed him slipping through the cracks. But the flooring records didn't lie, and the old employment logs didn't vanish, and the fiber in evidence wasn't going away. Lena zoomed in on a recent photo of Vesper taken during a community barbecue. He stood beside children smiling proudly, his arm resting lightly on a team banner. He looked harmless, almost gentle. But Lena had reviewed enough cases to know that the most dangerous individuals often worked hardest to appear safe. What chilled her wasn't his expression. It was the calm in his eyes. The kind of calm that comes from knowing no one has ever suspected you. If he truly was the man they were looking for, then he had hidden in this quiet suburb for 33 years undisturbed, unnoticed, untouched. Lena closed the file and whispered, "Time to watch you closely." Surveillance was about to begin. Surveillance on Arthur Vesper began on a cold Monday morning. 2 unmarked units rotated shifts, parking far enough to avoid suspicion but close enough to track his movements. Lena joined the team for the first few hours, watching through a long-range lens as Vesper carried out his day. He left home at 7:12 a.m., carrying a packed lunch and a folded newspaper. He waved to a neighbor walking their dog, offered a quick joke, then drove off in an aging pickup that looked as unremarkable as everything else in his life. His routine was painfully ordinary. He worked at a landscaping company on the west side, clocking in early and clocking out just before sunset. He stopped at the same grocery store each week. He visited the same gas station. He never rushed, never acted nervous, never slipped or stumbled or revealed even a flicker of panic. He was steady, predictable, controlled. Detectives watching him traded quiet doubts. More than one wondered if Lena's lead was collapsing. The man they were observing looked like someone who never crossed a line, much less destroyed a life. Nothing in his movements hinted at a hidden past. But Lena refused to back off. She reminded the team that the worst offenders often spent years perfecting the performance of normal life. The lack of obvious signs wasn't comforting, it was unsettling. A man who lived this quietly after what he'd done wasn't harmless. He was disciplined. On the 4th day, Vesper did something different. He stopped at a small cafe, ordered coffee, and walked out with the cup in hand. He drank slowly as he crossed the lot, then tossed the empty cup into a public trash can before driving away. Lena's pulse jumped. This was the opening she had been waiting for. The discarded coffee cup was retrieved within minutes. Gloves on, evidence bag sealed, chain of custody logged. Lena didn't take her eyes off it. She followed the officer to the car like she feared the cup might vanish if she blinked. After 3 decades of stalled leads and unanswered questions, this tiny piece of trash carried the weight of an entire lifetime. She drove it herself to the state lab. Technicians began processing immediately. Swabs collected, DNA extracted, profiles loaded. Every step felt slower than the one before it. Lena stood behind the glass, hands clasped so tight her knuckles whitened. She'd waited days for this moment. The Denton family had waited generations. Hours passed, machines hummed, analysts conferred in low voices. Then one of them froze. A tech leaned toward the monitor, face draining of color. "Detective Hollis, you need to see this." Lena stepped forward. The screen displayed 2 DNA profiles. One from the coffee cup, one pulled from the trace lodged beneath Tessa's fingernail the night she vanished. They matched perfectly. For a moment, no one breathed. 3 decades of silence collapsed in an instant. The man who smiled at his neighbors, coached Little League, Trimmed hedges on quiet weekends, he was the same man who ripped a young woman from her life and walked away without a trace. The room felt heavier as the truth settled. This was him. No more theories. No more guesses. No more wandering in the dark. Arthur Vesper had finally been found. Subscribe before the next case reminds you. Evil blends in. If this shook you, imagine missing the next twist. Stay subscribed. Still won't subscribe? Comment why staying unprepared feels okay. The analyst broke the silence first. Detective, what do we do now? Lena didn't hesitate. We arrest him. Arthur Vesper's street was quiet when the unmarked vehicles rolled in. Morning sunlight hit the roofs, sprinklers clicked on in nearby yards, and children waited for their school buses without the slightest idea that everything around them was about to crack open. Lena watched from the passenger seat as officers approached Vesper's home. He stepped outside holding a garden trowel, dressed in worn work clothes, preparing for another day of landscaping. His expression didn't change. At first he looked confused, then cautious, then strangely blank as the lead officer called his name. Arthur Vesper, you're under arrest. For a second, he didn't move. Not to run, not to argue, not to deny. Just stillness, as if he'd always known this moment could come. Neighbors froze on their lawns. Parents pulled their children closer. A man who had fixed fences, coached teams, and attended their cookouts now stood in handcuffs while officers read him his rights. One woman covered her mouth and whispered, "Not him. Please tell me it's a mistake." Another stepped back like she'd been struck. "My son spent summers in his yard." The disbelief spread fast, rolling across the block like a shockwave. People stared at the quiet man they thought they understood, the one they trusted, the one they liked, the one they defended. Lena stepped forward as Vesper was placed in the patrol car. His face stayed still, calm, almost resigned. He never asked why. He never protested. The mask he'd worn for decades finally cracked, not with rage or guilt, but with the emptiness of someone who knew the silence had finally run out. When the door shut beside him, a sense of finality settled over the street. Nothing about this neighborhood would feel safe again. And for the first time in 33 years, the case was no longer frozen in time. Everything was moving toward the truth. The Denton home had grown quieter over the years, but grief never loosened its grip. Framed photos of Tessa still sat on the mantel, her smile frozen in time, untouched by the life she never got to finish. When detectives knocked on the door with the news, Vivian answered slowly, bracing herself for another update that led nowhere. But this time the officer's expression wasn't heavy with regret. It carried something different, something the family had stopped hoping for. Vivian sank into a chair as the words reached her. "Mrs. Denton, we've arrested the man responsible for Tessa." For a long moment, she didn't react. Her eyes glistened, her breath caught, and her hands shook as if her body didn't know how to process a sentence she'd been waiting decades to hear. Alvin took her hand, squeezing it gently, grounding her in a reality they'd almost given up on. Vivian closed her eyes and whispered, barely audible, "Tessa can finally rest." It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was something deeper, the release of a weight carried for more than half a lifetime. Closure didn't erase the loss. It didn't mend the empty chair at their table, or the birthdays she never celebrated, or the life stolen from her at 22, but it gave shape to the darkness that haunted them. It gave the family something solid after years of reaching for ghosts. When Alvin finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way he hadn't allowed for years. "We knew she deserved the truth. We just didn't know if we'd live long enough to hear it." Outside, sunlight spilled across the yard, the same light Tessa used to sit under while studying. For the first time in 33 years, it didn't feel cruel. It felt like acknowledgement. And the family held on to that moment, a moment earned through relentless waiting, and a truth that refused to stay hidden forever. When investigators brought Arthur Vesper into the station, officers who had never heard of the case stared in disbelief. They expected a man with menace in his posture, anger in his eyes, or guilt leaking through his expression. Instead, they saw someone who could have passed for a retired teacher or a friendly neighbor watering his lawn at sunrise. Age had softened his features. Lines marked his face, his hair carried streaks of gray, and his voice held a calm steadiness that felt rehearsed. Nothing about him matched the violence he'd buried 33 years ago. That contrast unsettled everyone. For decades, people had passed him in grocery store aisles, chatted with him at community events, trusted him with their children's sports teams. He blended so well into suburban life that he became forgettable, the kind of man no one questioned, no one watched, no one feared. But the truth had been living inside him the entire time, untouched by the years. Lena watched through the observation window as Vesper sat quietly at the table, hands folded, expression blank. He didn't ask for a lawyer at first. He didn't protest. He didn't raise his voice. It was as if the calm he showed his neighbors was the same calm he used to walk away from Tessa's apartment all those years ago. What chilled Lena most wasn't his silence. It was the thought of how many people like him slip into ordinary routines, wearing politeness like armor, making sure no one ever looks too closely. Time didn't erase what he did. It simply covered it under layers of quiet mornings, trimmed lawns, and harmless smiles. And now those layers were being peeled back one by one. The world finally saw the man he truly was. Not a neighbor, not a coach, a predator who had learned to grow old without leaving a trace. Arthur Vesper's arraignment drew a crowd so large the hallway outside the courtroom filled before sunrise. Reporters lined the walls, holding decades of unanswered questions. Neighbors from Naperville arrived in disbelief, some shaken, some furious, all trying to understand how the man they trusted had carried such a secret for so long. Inside, Vesper sat at the defense table with the same quiet posture he'd shown during his arrest. No emotion, no remorse, no flicker of the life he had destroyed. It was as if he had separated himself from the man he once was, as if he believed the years he spent pretending made him untouchable. The prosecutor read the charges aloud. The room fell silent with every count. Lena watched from the gallery, her hands clasped on her lap. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was the end of a chase that should never have taken 33 years. She thought of the fiber sealed in that envelope, waiting all this time for someone willing to listen to what it had been trying to say since 1985. Members of the Denton family sat a few rows ahead. Vivian leaned against Alvin, eyes fixed on the man who stole their daughter's future. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She simply stared with the strength of someone who had survived the kind of silence most families never escape. Community members whispered among themselves. How did he hide this long? How many times did he walk past us without a worry? When the hearing ended, people left in a stunned hush. The truth had weight, and it pressed on every person who stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse. Before the story closes, ask yourself, what would you have done in Hollis's place? Do you think Vesper acted alone, or is there more to uncover? Those questions lingered, heavy and unsettling, as the courtroom emptied. Even after the hearings began and the community confronted the truth, the weight of the case didn't simply vanish. Stories like Tessa's leave marks that time can't erase. They linger in the homes of those who loved her, in the files detectives refused to abandon, and in the quiet corners of a city that unknowingly carried a predator for decades. Lena Hollis stood outside the courthouse one evening as the sun dipped behind the buildings. The wind carried sounds of traffic, conversations, life moving forward, reminders that the world never stopped, even while justice waited. She thought of the box that sat untouched for years, the fiber that slept in darkness, the single detail that refused to stay silent. Justice had come, but it arrived carrying lessons too heavy to ignore. Monsters don't always appear the way people expect. They grow older. They blend in. They build routines that feel harmless, familiar, ordinary. And because of that, too many walk freely for far too long. The city learned something from this case, something uncomfortable, something most prefer not to face. Danger rarely announces itself. It hides in the everyday. It wears normal clothes. It shakes hands at community events. It waves from across the street. For the Denton family, closure didn't erase the pain, but it gave their daughter back the dignity stolen from her. Vivian's words echoed through every person who followed the case. Tessa can finally rest. But the message left behind wasn't just about Tessa. It was about awareness, about refusing to look away, about paying attention to the signs others miss. And as this story closes, one truth stands firm. Stay informed. Stay aware. Stay subscribed. because the next case might be the one that saves someone else.